Awesome, cool. So welcome to the first BanklessDeSci conference. I'm going to talk today about decentralized IP and IP-NFTs. For everyone, again, my name is Paul Kohlhaas. I'm the CEO and co-founder of an organization called Molecule. Cool, Molecule at a glance. These are kind of stats from early this year. What we're doing at Molecule is really creating collaborative ecosystems where stakeholders in drug development and biotech can work together to expedite the process of bringing novel therapeutics to patients. To date, in the DeSci ecosystem, we've had over 1,300 research projects that have applied from across the world. There's over 6 bio-DAOs that we've actively supported and helped bring to life. Many of your favorite DeSci projects such as VITA-DAO, HairDAO, ValleyDAO, AthenaDAO, SciDAO, CryoDAO. Our communities count over 20,000 members. There have been over 35 million in total that have been raised into our ecosystem. And collectively, the organizations, the scientific projects that we've helped co-create count over 175 million. Much in thanks to all of you guys, our earliest supporters. So what's our mission at Molecule? I think it's really important always to dive in at a high level before we get into the weeds of intellectual property. Molecule's goal is really to change the way that intellectual property works, specifically in early stage drug development. We believe that biotech and the pharmaceutical system are kind of one of the last big monopolistic and pipeline-like industries, and that are really ripe for change. What personally brought me into the space was that a very close family member of mine was prescribed antidepressants and an ADHD medication when they were quite young, and consecutively really became addicted and reliant on these substances. And so at the age of 16, I really started asking myself, like, hey, is there a more open system that could perhaps better help get the right cures to the right patients? So at Molecule, we're really focused on making IP transactable in Web3 and enabling sustainability for organizations that want to collaboratively and democratically develop drugs. IP, our problem child. So at Molecule, we really honed down on IP as being the core driver of the pharmaceutical system and of kind of drug development in biotech today. However, IP as an asset class has barely evolved or even been digitized. If IP today, for example, with the US PTO, you receive a box of papers. It's a highly bureaucratic process of filing. It feels like in the early 2000s. Maybe as a little exercise for all of you, I recommend going onto the website of the US PTO and, for example, searching for a patent in a given kind of disease area, and it feels like diving back into the early 2000s. So patents today are highly monopolistic, and because they are monopolistic, they create perverse incentives for collaboration. For example, if I'm an organization that has a patent on a drug, I may disincentivize or kind of like cut out other people that are trying to work to bring similar drugs to market. Or, for example, if let's say you're a researcher at a university, you look at a specific class of molecules and you find one that you're like, oh, wow, this one's super interesting. This could be a potential cure for cancer. Maybe you want to write your master thesis or your PhD thesis on that. You begin looking at it, and then you realize, oh, it's been patented by a large pharmaceutical company. Can't touch that. Patents really disincentivize collaboration, and they disincentivize open science because it means that innovation can only happen within one organization, one company. As I mentioned previously, they are largely analog today in a digital world. They're not programmatic. Like, they're really, really hard to transact. They're really hard to value. They're hard to transfer between organizations, and it's difficult to use them as an incentive. Typically, how patents are used as incentives is by creating an equity vehicle, a company that owns a bunch of patents. But typically, actually, as an investor or as a patient, you only want access to one piece of IP. You don't want access to like a whole portfolio. And the last point is that once a patent or a piece of IP is inside of an organization, it's really hard to get it out or to kind of transfer it. So this is known often as the valley of death. It's why so much innovation remains in academia, is because we really lack global standardized licensing frameworks. If you go and work with a university, with their tech transfer office to try and get the IP out of there, it's typically a process that can take anywhere 6 to 12 months. And that's because the negotiation required between licensing parties takes so long. For example, if you want to finance some research at a university for, let's say, $200,000, in many cases the legal costs required to establish these licensing frameworks is just not even worth it. That's how the world works today. And so our goal is really to make this whole process much more efficient and really create an open source operating system for intellectual property and open science. So with that said, we're revolutionizing how intellectual property works in early stage drug development and science. Diving a little bit deeper into how this works from a macroeconomic perspective. So my background is in economics. I originally studied in Switzerland. And so I looked a lot at game theory and incentives for innovation. What you see below is the typical drug development cycle. So drugs go through discovery, preclinical stages, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. This process today takes up to 10 years. And we feel that the primary problem is because what I talked about earlier, that you have one organization working on one patent that they own. They've disincentivized anyone else to work on it. Yet diseases are global phenomenon, right? Like cancer, heart diseases affect all humans. Yet we've created a system where one company will own the rights to a potential cure, but then they also have to shoulder all of the costs, all of the risks, and do it by themselves. And so this is the typical, what you see above is the typical kind of uh, innovation cycle that happens inside of an organization. You have idea generation, project definition, concept development, and then at the end, you typically have one or two ideas that can actually go to market. Now, our concept of molecule is, what if we break up these siloed innovation cycles that happen inside of companies, and we break them up and create one global market where these intellectual property assets, these new cures, this phenomenal research and scientific progress can actually prosper. This is an early design from, I think, starts from 2022, although our marketplace today doesn't look that different. It's essentially came out, what if we enabled for IP assets and for science, the same thing that happened for NFTs in the art space, for example. And so this is designed for the Molecule marketplace today. You can actually go on discover.molecule.to and find research projects. And so our goal is really to take individual IP assets and turn them into a public marketplace for intellectual property. What is the building block of this marketplace? Well, it's a new Web3 native legal primitive that we've developed, which is called an IP-NFT. And for us, an IP-NFT is really a building block for DeSci. It's fundamentally programmable, so you can program royalties and ownership, can be digitally programmable. It's transactable between different parties. A process that typically took, as I said earlier, 6 to 12 months, technically now you can do in 5 minutes, just as you transfer another NFT. These IP assets and the science can be sold, traded, licensed, and also fractionalized. Through that, it can become highly liquid. And furthermore, it becomes data rich. And we'll dive into actually what the infrastructure of an IP-NFT looks like. So broadly speaking, this is kind of a diagram from the typical drug development process. Typically, as I said earlier, this happens within one company, but using Molecule System now, you can have an IP asset, you can have the IP creator upload the asset, you can have different research groups getting involved, exchanging research data for ownership in the asset, you can have early investors and speculators, then you can have patient groups getting involved at a later stage. And now all of these actors are collaborating in a modular way and in a decentralized way to bring a potential cure or a potential scientific project to market. So let's dive deeper into the anatomy of an IP-NFT. At first, you have a real-world legal contract that, so many of you have probably heard about real-world assets. IP-NFTs are not too different than real-world assets, instead that it's not a real estate. And it's actually why we believe IP is a perfect use case, or the biotech IP is a perfect use case in crypto and Web3, because it's already intangible, right? Often you call intellectual property assets intangibles. Well, they don't exist. They only exist today in legal contracts. So there's a real world legal contract. We work with some of the best IP licensing and biotech licensing firms, both in the US and in the EU. You have identities, physical addresses, for example, of the licensing parties, wallet addresses, a transaction hash of the signed transaction, the IP terms, and the details. This legal contract is then actually encrypted. It's encrypted combined with a smart contract that lives on Ethereum. The metadata JSON is then stored on Arweave, and the encrypted IP, patent, and data, so all of the secret sauce that relates to the IP, is stored on Lit protocol, which runs on Filecoin. I'll stop here. You can find a lot more about this architecture, about our documentation, if you go on molecule.xyz. Most of our architecture is open source, so please feel free to give us feedback, fiddle around with it, be critical. I'll briefly run through the process of how minting an IP-NFT works. So you have a researcher who wants to do a research project and is willing to fund it by selling their future IP that may originate from it. You then, on the other side, you have an individual, an organization, or a DAO that wants to own IP that arises from this research project and wants to fund it. You then typically have a negotiation period, an agreement, and contract signing. This is an application layer that we're providing through Molecule. Then, as I said previously, the metadata is encrypted. You define access conditions. So for example, I can now say, let's say Alice is the researcher, Bob is the sponsor of the research, or Bob DAO. And Bob DAO now defines, once they've sponsored it, who gets access to the underlying IP so that it can be developed in an open and in a collaborative way. For example, you might have different working group members in the DAO that have verified their wallet. And now those verified wallet addresses can be added as viewers of the IP or even as editors. All of this is then encapsulated in ERC 721 or in an ERC 1155. What does this look like in practice? So this is not theory. We funded a whole bunch of these IP-NFTs already. VITA-DAO, as many of you may know, is one of the primary kind of creators of IP-NFTs today. One of the most exciting projects that we've come across, for example, is a project on autophagy activator drug discovery from Newcastle University. This project was funded on December 23rd, 2021. So almost 2 years ago. Hey, DeSci didn't just appear yesterday. This was funded almost 2 years ago for $285,000. And we're going to see throughout this presentation how the project actually evolved over that time frame. So VITA-DAO was funded over $5 million in research to date. There's a couple of examples here. Another exciting one is with the Scheibe Knudsen Lab at the University of Copenhagen. There's an exciting project underway with the Van der Fang's lab at the University of Oslo. Typically, these funding amounts tend to be between $100,000, $250,000, maybe $500,000. And they're also milestone-based, meaning that based on the project and the researcher hitting certain milestones, the DAO that funds it releases more funding over time. If the research is not successful, then the DAO can kind of terminate the agreement because why throw more money at a project that's not working, right? So what now happens with these IP-NFTs, right? What can I do with this? And fundamentally, where we see this going is really in the creation of a new asset class that makes translational research fundable and governable by patients, researchers, entrepreneurs, and communities. So IP-NFTs can now mint IPTs. And I'm going to make this less confusing in a second. But what this really does is it makes digital IP transactions possible. We now can create liquid market for IPTs. So whereas an IP-NFT is an ERC 721 or an ERC 1155, predominant ERC 1155 today, IPTs are ERC 20s. And this now enables the tokenization of IP as an incentive layer and as a governance layer for decentralized communities. So an IP-NFT today typically is a digital on-chain authentication of IP rights that are held by a research and development sponsor. So an IP-NFT is minted. It contains a patent or a license or a research agreement. This is attached to a smart contract. These things today are typically held by DAOs. So the DAO forms almost like an incubator now around this IP. And when the DAO feels the time is right, it can now begin tokenizing the IP to kind of open it up. IPTs can be held by individuals. And intellectual IPT stands for intellectual property token, and they are fungible governance tokens that are minted using IP-NFTs to now distribute IP rights to a much broader set of stakeholders. IPTs now transform research outcomes into composable digital assets. And we think this is really exciting because this now enables price discovery for IP. It enables much more liquid project-based incentives. For example, imagine there's a patient group that could be really relevant for the development of a specific IP asset, or perhaps participate even in a decentralized clinical trial. You could now distribute ownership in that particular IP asset to that patient group for contributing work or contributing data. Likewise, you can do this for scientists. And we believe this fundamentally might revolutionize how drugs are being developed and how intellectual property is being developed. The typical life cycle of an IPT looks kind of like this. A researcher defines a translational research project and identifies the intellectual property that will be tokenized. You mint the IP-NFT. I've gone through that. You then can create an IPT. And kind of whoever owns the IP-NFT can decide, cool, I'm gonna create an IPT. And then you ideally have a group of stakeholders that now buy into the IPT. Molecules infrastructure provides this. Typically, for example, this is done through an auction. And then IPTs can be distributed to the university or to the researcher. What can you now do with this? So now you really have a chance to engage the community. IPT holders have a say in governance of the IP, and they can participate in key decision makings related to the research. They can also raise further funding. So IPTs can now be issued and sold to raise additional funding for the project. At any point, IPT holders can vote to license the IP to a startup, or to, for example, raise money via an equity financing if they wanted to create a startup around this. You can really think of this like a mini DAO that has now emerged around one particular project. Of course, doing this might only make sense once you have sufficient positive data around a project. And that's how most of the DAOs that are in our space are kind of going about this. So as I said, maybe to summarize, IPTs can be exchanged for work, for funding, or for contributions around a particular research project. IPTs enable open source collaboration without losing the commercial viability around the project. So this is something typical, like why can't you just use GitHub for drug development and kind of develop medicines out in the open? The problem is with doing that, you forever invalidate the IP. You'll never have a chance to potentially file patents around the project. And while I personally hate patents and I hate the patent system, unfortunately, in today's world, it is a necessary evil in order to actually fund the high costs of clinical trials later on. And so IPTs for us, while they don't fully represent a fully open intellectual property system yet, or like full open science, they're actually what we feel is an amazing middle ground that can really spur innovation today. One of the best examples of IP-NFTs and IPTs today is VITA-FAST. VITA-FAST was the first IPT launched by VITA. And it was a really wild success. So in June of this year, over 200 participants participated in the first kind of auction. On the top right, you can kind of see the VITA-FAST crowd sale that took place via the Molecule platform. There was a funding goal. The funding goal was very humble. It was $35,000. The project didn't need that much more. It wanted to fundraise for one additional experiment. And there was still funding available. And in total, the project was 1,700% oversubscribed. It ended up raising this 35K. The way that this worked is, as a VITA-DAO token holder, you have the right to participate in these IP offerings. So the more VITA tokens you hold, the more you have right to fund one of these IPTs and participate in one of these auctions. The current market cap today is 15.3 billion. So the price since that auction of VITA-FAST has increased almost exponentially. What's really exciting, though, is that at the same time, over 5% of the IPTs were also redistributed back to the university, even though VITA-DAO had no obligation to. It essentially said, hey, it's really important to give something back to the university. Today, what the university has gotten back is over 800,000 in equivalent value in IP ownership in this project. In the VITA-FAST community, we love using fast and furious memes. I've taken two charts here just because I always think it's a little bit interesting to look at what is actually happening on chain now in terms of price discovery. So there was a period of initial price discovery here in early June where the project shot up, I think, to about a 2 million valuation from 350K and then kind of stabilized at around 1.4 million. And then over the consecutive month, more and more data was released about this project. And maybe just a reminder, so this is a researcher, Viktor Kowalczyk, you can see him at the bottom right here, that is working on autophagy activators. And autophagy activators are essentially drugs that mimic the fasting process in the human body. And what fasting does is that it promotes longevity. So this could really be a prime candidate that could substantially lengthen our lifespan by inducing the same positive benefits that fasting introduces, but without obviously having to fast. So prompting our cells to do a similar thing. Around September, October, very transparently in the community, it was released that 4 of the drug candidates that Viktor Kowalczyk was investigating had very positive data, and subsequently the market responded. If you want to check it out, you can check it out on Dune. There's a Dune dashboard, there's a deck screener, or you can check out the IP-NFT. I'm sure I can share the links later on, but you can also very easily just Google VITA-FAST or go on VITA-DAO and VITA-FAST. Where is all of this going? So I'm going to give a very brief closing ecosystem outlook. So today at Molecule, we have over 1,200 projects that have come in. And of those, around 13 IP-NFTs have been minted. And as you see, 1 IP-NFT has been minted. Our next really, and where's all of this going? So the goal is really to discover scientific projects that work, right? And the goal is really to translate them to patients and to be able to commercialize them so that ultimately one day they can be accessed in a pharmacy or prescribed by a doctor. The way that we're empowering this at Molecule is initially in January, you can expect the launch of a new seed marketplace where you can discover this bulk of projects in a much more open way. And increasingly, we're then building an IP coordination hub and specialized exchanges where these IPTs can be exchanged and traded. And all of the bio-DAOs are kind of operating in this flurry of projects. As we've seen, some of them are focused on hair loss, some of them are focused on synthetic biology, some of them are focused on longevity and aging. We have others focused on psychedelic research. And we really hope to empower this new era of science and this new flurry of decentralization of projects. Ultimately, always with the goal to bring the science much faster and much more cost efficiently to patients. And the power of DeSci, in my view, is that you can all be a part of that. I think that's really amazing. What's actually missing in this diagram is the scientist here. So one of our core goals in Molecule is really reuniting the scientists and the patients, because instead of only getting involved here, the patient can now get involved here in the seed stage or in the IP-NFT stage. The patient can get involved in a DAO, or she can directly, if she wants to contribute data to an IPT or fund an IPT. We're building towards a world where scientists, instead of spending 80% of their time applying for funding, they're spending 80% of their time doing science and only 20% of time applying for funding. That's a statistic that we often heard. Scientists have to spend so much time applying for funding, and it's a shame. They should be doing the science. We are working towards a world where patient and researcher communities govern cures and access to medications. We're working towards a world where scientists are fairly paid and incentivized for their work. Thank you. I've got a couple of calls to action here. You can get involved in the Molecule ecosystem today. Just join our Discord. You can join a DAO. Most of these communities that I've mentioned today all have open Discords. You can get involved. If you're a scientist, please get in touch, apply to get funded. Viktor Kowalczyk's project, for example, was funded within 3 weeks. It took us 3 weeks to get the IP out licensed out of the university, funds transferred. 3 weeks. You can fund a DAO or an IPT, support these communities, obtain governance on chain, help make a difference. And we're also actively hiring. If you're a developer, if you're a scientist, if you're a biotech entrepreneur, please get in touch. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So the IP-NFT backend is really a permissionless. So maybe to repeat Rod's question, how could the IP-NFT infrastructure that Molecule has developed be utilized across other use cases or for other communities? Rod, is that correct? Cool. So yeah, so something that I've learned as an entrepreneur is that it's really important to focus on your niche. So we've really designed Molecule to work around initially, and for IP-NFTs to work around sponsored research agreements, specifically in biotech and in medical research. And that's probably one of the most difficult forms of IP and IP class. And but fundamentally, the system that we've developed can be used for any type of IP, and or it could be used for engineering. It could be used for space. I personally have a vision that, for example, this could also be used for AI algorithms to self bootstrap them into existence by the IP being actually housed by the algo or the whole LLM being housed, the model being housed in an IP NFT. This vast oversimplification, but to answer your question, Rod, the framework can be used by kind of any type of community. Technically, we already have communities out of the climate tech space that are actively looking into using this. There's an organization called ValleyDAO that is focused on synthetic biology and biomanufacturing. They recently minted an IP NFT that is focused on biolipids from algae, actually. Biolipids are like new types of oils. And so we're already moving out of the realm of typical medicine and biotech into the realm of bioengineering and space engineering, bioengineering. Like ultimately for us, it's all IP and it's all data. And what we're fundamentally passionate about is really enabling collaboration between communities and scientists.